The sand of the Colosseum floor was dark with blood when she was dragged out at noon. Aurelia's IA, a 23-year-old freedwoman, was accused of poisoning her former master's wife. Despite enduring 3 days of preliminary torture that left her unable to walk without assistance, the guards held her roughly. They didn't need to be gentle. The 50,000 Romans filling the seats above were finishing their midday meals, chatting casually. They hardly glanced at the arena floor, where the morning's animal hunts had concluded and the afternoon's gladiatorial matches hadn't yet begun. This all belonged to the condemned. Aurelia felt the heat of the sand through the thin shift they left her in, already torn from the rough handling. The smell of blood and death from the morning's kills still lingered, mixing with the casual murmurs of the spectators, their disinterest palpable. She saw others being led out behind her, 7 men and 3 women, all scheduled to die in the next hour, each execution designed not only to kill but to entertain. She didn't know which method awaited her, but she would find out when it began. Des Ames Valeries Efesos, the arena master, consulted his wax tablet and gestured toward Aurelia. 2 attendants approached, carrying something that glittered in the Mediterranean sun. It took her a moment to understand a linen garment soaked in pitch and oil, designed to be placed on her body and ignited. The tuna molesta, the troublesome shirt. She had heard of this punishment. Everyone in Rome had. But hearing about fire and feeling it approaching your skin were 2 very different things. The burning garment was designed not for a quick death, but for one slow enough to be visible, prolonged, and theatrical. The garment soaked in pitch, resin, and animal fat burned slowly, creating flames that consumed the victim over 10 to 15 minutes. The victim was dressed while the garment was unlit, secured tightly to prevent removal, sometimes tied to posts to keep them upright as the flames spread. The ignition was itself a spectacle, with attendants lighting the garment from multiple directions. Aurelia experienced this method on an afternoon in approximately 115 CE during the reign of Trajan. The records from the time are clinical. Aurelia is a freedwoman, convicted of vilification against Claudia Marcella, wife of Gas patron Ias Arbiter, sentenced to arena execution. Method assigned Cassiopeia Unicom. Execution confirmed by arena physician at the 7th hour. The records don't describe her screams, the smell of her burning flesh, or how long she remained conscious as the flames ravaged her body. Medical experts estimate that victims remained aware for 3 to 8 minutes, depending on how the fire spread. What the records do note is that her execution was well received by the crowd, a phrase that often appears in arena administration documents, indicating that her death had been deemed satisfactory by those in attendance. Seneca, the philosopher, described the noon executions he witnessed decades earlier. He happened to return home at midday, expecting rest and relaxation after the morning's entertainments. Instead, I found something quite different. The men had no armor. Their bodies were completely exposed to every blow. The crowd preferred this to the regular matches. The crowd, it seemed, had developed a taste for death that was visible, prolonged, and unobstructed by protection. The tuna molesta was not only used in the arenas but also in private spectacles hosted by emperors. Nero infamously used condemned Christians as human torches to light his gardens at evening parties. Tacitus wrote, to suppress this rumor, Nero fabricated scapegoats and punished with every refinement the notoriously depraved Christians. Their deaths were made farcical. Dressed in wild animal skins, they were torn to pieces by dogs or crucified or made into torches to be ignited after dark as substitutes for daylight. Modern specialists estimate that 70% of victims who wore the burning garments died from shock and fluid loss, rather than from the flames themselves, the body shutting down from trauma before the fire could complete its work. The remaining 30% succumbed to asphyxiation or organ failure as their core temperatures rose. The death was never quick, nor was it merciful. The damnatio at best is, condemnation to beasts, was Rome's most famous execution method, but the popular image of prisoners being thrown to lions is overly simplistic. In reality, it was far more elaborate, involving a variety of animal species, staged scenarios, and carefully timed assaults designed to prolong the victim's suffering. Publius Salius Fortunatus, a 31-year-old merchant convicted of fraud against the imperial treasury, was sentenced to damnatio at best in 177 C. during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. The records describe his execution as follows: Publius Salius Fortunatus, citizen, convicted of P.C. Latticin furti um against the fiscus, sentenced to damnatio at best eyes in the Flavian amphitheater. Animals assigned: 3 bears, 2 leopards, 2 wild dogs, pack of 12. Staging bound to stake with extended exposure intervals. Fortunatus was bound to a stake in the center of the arena, and animals were released one at a time, with intervals between each assault. The wild dogs were first. They targeted extremities, tearing at hands, feet, and face. Then the leopards attacked, followed by the bears in the final phase. By the time the bears were released, Fortunatus had already been in the arena for over an hour. His body was ravaged by blood loss and shock. The crowd watched, commenting on his injuries, placing bets on how long he would survive. His death was confirmed as satisfactory, meaning the crowd had been entertained. Galen, the famous physician, described the beast executions. The beasts do not kill cleanly as soldiers do. They tear and rend without purpose, damaging flesh in ways that cause maximum bleeding without immediately fatal injury. I have seen men survive the first assault, the second, sometimes the third. The death comes from exhaustion as much as any single wound. For Fortunatus' death did not come from any one animal's bite. It came from the accumulated damage over time. The Ludimeri Dani, noon executions were brutal displays. The condemned were forced to fight each other with no armor, no training, and no possibility of survival. The records describe Laetitia Sabina, a 26-year-old slave convicted of killing her master during an attempted escape. She fought Gaius Vettius, convicted of property crimes, and killed him after 4 minutes of combat. Immediately afterward, she was paired against Sextus Pomponius, convicted of embezzlement, and killed after 7 minutes. Laetitia Sabina, slave of Marcus Aurelius Grata, convicted of homicidium of her master, sentenced to Ludimeri Dani, paired first against Gaius Vettius, convicted of latrocinium, whom she killed after 4 minutes of combat. Paired second against Sextus Pomponius, convicted of peculatus, by whom she was killed after 7 minutes of combat. The Ludimeri Dani were not about combat skill or glory. They were a spectacle, designed for maximum suffering and entertainment. Seneca described them as fatal charades, theatrical productions where the condemned were forced to kill or be killed, stripped of all dignity, all hope of survival, forced into violence before they themselves were slain. The mythological executions were among the most disturbing. They were staged performances where condemned prisoners acted out fatal myths. A man named Marcus Sulpius Stephanus, convicted of theft from a temple, was forced to reenact the myth of Orpheus, pretending to play his lyre before being torn apart by a bear. Tacitus described similar executions. What before was performed in myth is now performed in the arena. Pasiphae really did mate with a Dictaean bull. Believe it. We have seen it. The prisoners weren't simply acting, they were living out their deaths. The Pasiphae execution involving women was perhaps the most depraved. Women convicted of sexual crimes were placed in devices that allowed them to be assaulted by bulls. The specifics of their deaths varied, but the purpose was always spectacle, their violation viewed as part of the entertainment. Tertullian, a Christian writer, condemned these executions, noting, "We see women given not merely to death, but to defilement before death." The arena that claims to uphold Roman virtue displays acts that would shame the most degraded barbarian. Throughout history, his methods of death were not merely about punishment but about spectacle. The condemned were turned into entertainment, their deaths optimized for the crowd's enjoyment. The Romans did not just create roads, aqueducts, or libraries. They built a system of mass execution and torture, institutionalized cruelty, and normalized suffering for entertainment. And when you visit the ruins, remember the stones are stained with blood. The crowds cheered, and the empire called it civilization. What comes after that realization is the uncomfortable part that most histories avoid, because it forces us to look at ourselves instead of safely judging the past. The Roman arena did not survive for 4 centuries because Romans were uniquely cruel, or because they were morally inferior to the people who came before or after them. It survived because it worked. It worked politically, socially, and psychologically. The arena absorbed fear, anger, and resentment that might otherwise have turned against the state. It unified crowds through shared spectacle. It transformed punishment into performance and performance into loyalty. When thousands of people sat together and watched the same suffering, reacted to it together, judged it together, they were participating in something larger than entertainment. They were participating in a ritual that reaffirmed who had power and who did not. That is the part we tend to miss. The executions were not random. They followed rules. Crimes were categorized. Deaths were matched to offenses. Methods were chosen not only to kill but to communicate meaning. Fire for arson. Animals for outsiders. Sexualized violence for women accused of sexual transgression. Public humiliation for slaves. Each death told a story the state wanted told, and the audience learned to read those stories fluently. Over time, repetition did what repetition always does. It dulled empathy. The first time someone watched a person burn, they were likely horrified. The 10th time, less so. The 100th time, it became background noise. That normalization is the true legacy of the arena. Not the blood itself, but the way ordinary people learned to accept it was normal, deserved, even enjoyable. This is why the Roman arena matters far beyond ancient history. Because it shows what happens when suffering is systemated and justified. When bureaucracy replaces conscience. When violence is framed as necessary, entertaining, or morally instructive. When spectators are taught that what they are seeing is not cruelty but order. The Romans told themselves stories to make it bearable. These people were criminals. They were enemies. They were impure. They were less than fully human. Once those stories were accepted, everything that followed became easier. The crowd did not see Aurelia or Septimia or Claudia. They saw categories. They saw examples. They saw warnings. Every society tells itself similar stories, even if the stages look different. The mechanisms change. The language softens. The spectacle becomes mediated through screens instead of stone seating. But the logic remains familiar. If punishment can be made visible, if suffering can be framed as deserved, if audiences can be convinced that what they are watching is justice rather than cruelty, then the system sustains itself. That is why the ruins matter. Not because they are beautiful but because they are honest. The Colosseum does not hide what it was built for. Its shape exists because tens of thousands of people needed clear sightlines to watch other people die. Its tunnels exist because bodies had to be moved efficiently. Its sand exists because blood had to be absorbed and replaced between acts. When you stand there today, you are standing inside a machine that worked exactly as designed. The people who died there did not die for honor. They did not die for glory. They did not die so history could admire Rome. They died because their deaths were useful. And once suffering becomes useful, it becomes repeatable. That is the lesson the arena leaves behind. Not that Rome was cruel, but that cruelty becomes ordinary when it is organized, justified, and applauded. Not that ancient people were monsters, but that ordinary people, given permission and repetition, can learn to watch almost anything. The danger is not that we remember Rome incorrectly. The danger is that we remember it too comfortably. And that is where the story truly ends, not with the last scream in the sand, not with the final body dragged through the gate, but with the silence that follows once an audience decides it has seen enough. Empires rarely collapse because they are evil. They collapse because they convince themselves that what they are doing is necessary. Rome did not wake up one day and decide to turn death into entertainment. It arrived there gradually, step by step, execution by execution. Each one justified by law, tradition, or public order. By the time the arena reached its peak, no single Roman citizen felt responsible for what happened there. Responsibility had been diluted into procedure, into schedules, into crowd reactions recorded as favorable. That diffusion of responsibility is the most dangerous artifact Rome left behind. When cruelty is divided into roles, the magistrate who sentences, the official who assigns the method, the attendants who carry it out, the physician who confirms death, the crowd who watches, no one feels like the monster. Everyone is simply doing their part. And when everyone is doing their part, the machine runs smoothly. The people in the stands did not think of themselves as killers. They were spectators, consumers of spectacle, participants in civic life. They laughed, ate, talked, argued, flirted, complained about the heat, complained about the quality of the executions, complained when a death was too fast or not dramatic enough. They went home afterward to their families. They told stories. They came back next week. And that is the most unsettling truth of all. Nothing about this required extraordinary evil. It required familiarity. The arena trained people to watch suffering without intervening, to judge it aesthetically, to rank it, to decide which deaths were better, which were boring, which were disappointing. It taught people that empathy was optional and that distance was virtue. Over generations, that training became instinct. When later Romans spoke nostalgically about the games, they did not remember the victims. They remembered the excitement, the scale, the grandeur, the feeling of belonging to something vast and powerful. Violence became memory, and memory became pride. This is why the arena must not be reduced to gladiators and marble ruins, because doing so allows us to pretend the horror was incidental rather than central. The arena was not a side effect of Roman civilization. It was one of its instruments. And instruments do not disappear when the civilization that created them falls. They change form. The lesson Rome leaves us is not about ancient cruelty. It is about what happens whenever suffering is framed as necessary, instructive, or entertaining. Whenever institutions measure success by audience approval rather than human cost. Whenever people are taught to look away from the individual and focus on the category. The sand absorbed the blood. The empire absorbed the guilt. The crowd absorbed the habit. What remains is the warning. Because the moment a society decides that some lives exist primarily to be watched in pain, the arena has already been rebuilt no matter what shape it takes. And if you think this belongs safely to the past, that it died with the emperors in the crumbling stone, look more closely at what survives. The Romans did not invent cruelty. They perfected its presentation. They learned that suffering becomes acceptable when it is framed as order, that death becomes tolerable when it is scheduled, that people will watch almost anything if it is labeled tradition, justice, or entertainment. The arena was not chaos. It was management, timetables, categories, approved methods, crowd metrics, a bureaucracy of pain. That is why the Colosseum still stands, not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. Long after the last execution, long after the sand stopped drinking blood, the logic of the arena remained intact. Decide who is disposable. Strip them of individuality. Assign a narrative that makes their suffering feel deserved. Invite the public to watch, but never to intervene. Call it necessary. Call it normal. Call it civilization. The Romans told themselves that the condemned were criminals, enemies, heretics, slaves, outsiders, people who did not belong. Once that boundary was drawn, everything that followed felt justified. The fire, the beasts, the rack, the sand, the cheers. The system depended not on hatred but on distance. And distance is easy to maintain when the victims are reduced to roles instead of names. Aurelia, Publius, Lysania, Claudia, Septimia. Names that survived only because a clerk wrote them down before marking a death as confirmed. Hundreds of thousands more vanished without even that courtesy. Absorbed into statistics, into spectacle, into dust beneath the arena floor. The crowd went home believing they had seen justice. The empire went on believing it was strong. And both were wrong, because strength that requires ritualized cruelty is already decaying. Power that needs an audience to validate its violence is already afraid. An empire that teaches its people to watch suffering calmly is teaching them something far more dangerous than obedience. It is teaching them to stop recognizing themselves in others. That is how civilizations hollow out from the inside. The stones remain. The arches still rise. Tourists walk where the sand once lay. Children eat ice cream and take photographs where people burned, bled, drowned, and screamed for hours. History becomes architecture. Horror becomes heritage. But memory is a choice. You can look at the Colosseum and see engineering, ambition, greatness. Or you can remember what it was built to contain. 50,000 seats facing a pit where human beings were dismantled for fun. An execution chamber disguised as culture. The Romans called it entertainment. They were wrong. It was a warning. Because the arena does not begin with fire or beasts or blood. It begins the moment a society decides that some lives exist for display, not dignity. And it ends only when people refuse to sit down and watch. That is the part of the story that is not finished yet. And that is why this story does not really end with Rome. Because the arena was never just a place. It was a formula. Once you understand the formula, you start seeing its outline everywhere. Not with sand and stone, not with lions and fire, but with the same mechanics quietly reused. Identify a group. Declare them dangerous, immoral, corrupt. disposable. Wrap their punishment in language that sounds reasonable. Law, security, tradition, morality. Then make their suffering visible just enough that others learn the lesson, but distant enough that no one feels responsible. The Romans didn't need every citizen to enjoy the executions. They only needed most people to accept them, to walk past, to eat lunch, to look away when the screams began. That was enough. The most important spectators were never the ones in the front runs. They were the ones who stayed silent. That is the detail most histories skip. Empires don't collapse because they are cruel. They collapse because cruelty stops feeling remarkable. When pain becomes routine, when death becomes content, when humiliation becomes policy, something essential erodes. Not all at once. Slowly, quietly, until people no longer notice what they've agreed to tolerate. Rome fell centuries after the Colosseum opened, but the moral failure began the moment the first crowd applauded an execution and told themselves it was normal, and the victims understood this long before the historians did. We don't have Aurelius' words. We don't know what Publius thought as the dogs came back for the final attack. We don't know what Lys and Ea felt after killing another human being and realizing she would not be spared. The records didn't care about those things. The system didn't require their inner lives. Only their bodies. That is the final violence. Not just killing people, but erasing the idea that their experience mattered. The arena trained an entire civilization to separate spectacle from empathy, to cheer with one part of the mind while silencing another, to call themselves civilized while watching others be destroyed. And that training worked, which is why remembering this matters. Not to wallow in horror, not to indulge fascination with cruelty, but to recognize the pattern before it repeats with different costumes and better excuses, to notice when suffering is framed as necessary, when punishment is sold as entertainment, when crowds are invited to watch instead of act. History doesn't repeat because people forget dates. It repeats because people forget mechanisms. The Colosseum still stands because stone lasts longer than conscience. But the story carved into its foundations is not about Rome's greatness. It is about the cost of confusing power with virtue. So when you look at the ruins, don't imagine gladiators in glory. Imagine the silence between screams. Imagine the people who watched and did nothing. Imagine how ordinary it all felt by the end. That is the real legacy of the arena. And the question history leaves us with is not whether Rome was cruel. It is whether we recognize the arena when it is rebuilt without sand. And there is one final thing the arena teaches, something even darker than the executions themselves. It teaches how quickly human beings learn to adapt. No one walks into the Colosseum for the first time already numb. The first execution would have been shocking. The second disturbing. The 10th uncomfortable. By the 100th routine. By the 1000th forgettable. That curve of adaptation is the most dangerous force in any society, because it doesn't require evil people to function. It only requires ordinary people who get used to things. The Romans told themselves stories to make that adaptation easier. The condemned were criminals, enemies, slaves, heretics, people who deserved it, people who were already outside the moral circle. Once someone is placed outside that circle, anything done to them becomes permissible. Once enough people agree with that logic, cruelty stops needing justification. This is why the arena had to keep escalating. Fire wasn't enough, so they added animals. Animals weren't enough, so they added staging. Staging wasn't enough, so they added mythology. Mythology wasn't enough, so they added sexual violence. Each step was a response to boredom. Each new method existed because the last one no longer provoked a reaction strong enough to satisfy the crowd. Entertainment always demands novelty. Suffering is no exception. And that is why the most unsettling detail in all the surviving records is not the descriptions of pain, but the notes about crowd reception. Well received, approved, satisfactory. Someone was always watching the watchers, measuring their response, refining the product. The arena was not just killing people. It was training taste. When that taste changed, the system changed with it. When crowds wanted blood, they got blood. When they wanted spectacle, they got spectacle. When they wanted something new, the state invented new ways for human bodies to fail. The victims were interchangeable. The appetite was not. And when Christianity eventually rose and the arenas closed, this did not happen because Rome suddenly discovered compassion. It happened because the moral framework changed just enough that public executions stopped being useful in that particular form. The machinery of power did not vanish. It simply moved. Execution left the arena and entered the courtroom. Spectacle moved from sand to paper. Death became quieter, cleaner, less visible. The audience was no longer 50,000 people in stone seats, but millions absorbing narratives about who deserved what. The arena didn't disappear. It evolved. That is why these stories matter now. Because every time a society turns punishment into performance, every time it ranks suffering by how acceptable it feels, every time it decides some lives are instructional rather than inviolable, it is rebuilding the arena piece by piece. Not with lions. With language. With categories. With silence. The Romans thought they were watching justice. They thought they were watching order being restored. They thought they were watching criminals get what they deserved. And because they thought that, they didn't see what they were becoming. No one in the Colosseum thought they were cruel. They thought they were normal. That is the most important lesson the arena leaves behind. Cruelty does not announce itself as cruelty. It announces itself as tradition, as necessity, as entertainment, as common sense. It asks very little of its audience. Only that they keep watching. Only that they don't ask too many questions. Only that they accept what is placed before them. And once they do, the system takes care of the rest. Aurelia Terzia did not die because Rome hated her. She died because Rome didn't care enough to stop. Because her suffering fit neatly into a schedule. Because her death filled a gap between events people actually came to see. That is how most systems of violence function. Not through hatred but through convenience. So when you walk past the ruins, when you see the artisan corridors and imagine the roar of the crowd, remember this: the most dangerous part of the Colosseum was not the beasts or the fire or the blades. It was the seats. Because that is where people learned to be comfortable with the unbearable. And history does not ask us whether we would have survived the arena. It asks whether we would have recognized it while sitting in the crowd. That is where the story ends. Not with Rome. With us. And if that ending feels unresolved, that's because it is supposed to. History does not close its books neatly. It leaves fingerprints. It leaves habits. It leaves systems that look different on the surface but operate on the same internal logic. The Roman arena was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration. What Rome proved, more clearly than almost any civilization before or after, is that suffering can be normalized if it is framed correctly. That violence can be made acceptable if it is ritualized. That human beings can watch other human beings die and horrific ways and still consider themselves moral, rational, civilized. The arena worked because it solved multiple problems at once. It punished crime. It reinforced social hierarchy. It distracted the population. It unified the crowd around a shared spectacle. It converted fear into loyalty and boredom into obedience. It was efficient. That is why it lasted for centuries. And that efficiency is the part that should unsettle you most. Because nothing about it required madness. It required administrators filling out tablets. Architects calculating sightlines. Trainers conditioning animals. Physicians confirming death. Poets framing executions as myth. Magistrates approving budgets. Vendors selling food. Families bringing children. All of it ordinary. All of it procedural. When cruelty becomes procedural, it becomes invisible. The victims become statistics. The methods become jargon. The deaths become confirmed. The suffering becomes completed. Language smooths the edges until no one has to confront what is actually happening. That is why the records feel so cold. That is why Aurelia Terzia's death is reduced to a line about crowd reception. That is why Publius Salius Fortunatus becomes a timetable. That is why children could watch and grow up thinking this was simply how the world worked. And once a generation grows up inside a system like that, it does not feel monstrous to them. It feels normal. It feels inevitable. It feels right. Every society tells itself that it would never do such things again. That it has learned. That it has progressed. That it is different now. And every society is partially telling the truth. We no longer burn people in amphitheaters. We no longer feed prisoners to lions. We no longer turn executions into afternoon entertainment. But the underlying questions remain. Who is allowed to suffer publicly? Whose pain is instructional? Whose death is justified by narrative? Who gets reduced to a category instead of a name? Who is declared disposable for the sake of order, safety, morality, or comfort? The Roman arena answers those questions one way. Other eras answer them differently, but the mechanism is always the same. Dehumanize, distance, display, normalize. The arena did not collapse because people suddenly felt empathy. It collapsed because its function was replaced. When power no longer needed blood in the sand to maintain control, the sand was swept clean. The stones remained, and today, people walk through them taking photos, smiling, admiring the engineering, calling it magnificent, calling it civilization. Very few stop to imagine the hours between events. The screams that echoed while people late. The bodies dragged away so the next spectacle could begin. The way death became background noise. That silence is the final legacy of the arena. Not the roar of the crowd. The quiet acceptance afterward. And that is why these stories must be told in full. Not as shock, not as spectacle, but as warning. Because the moment we believe we are too advanced, too moral, too enlightened to repeat this pattern, we stop recognizing it when it returns in new forms. History does not repeat because people forget facts. It repeats because people forget mechanisms. The Roman arena was a machine. It took human beings and unturned suffering into order, fear into entertainment, and death into routine. Machines like that do not disappear. They wait. And whether they are rebuilt depends on who is willing to look at them honestly and who would rather look away. That is the real ending of this story. Not in ancient Rome, but wherever human lives are turned into spectacle, and the crowd convinces itself that it is only watching. The story doesn't end in the ruins of the Colosseum or in the faded ink of ancient records. It continues in the present, in the systems we built, in the subtle ways power manipulates perception and maintains control. What happened in the arenas of Rome was a spectacle, yes, but it was also a lesson in the mechanics of dehumanization, the normalizing of cruelty, and the way that society can turn a blind eye to suffering when it's framed as entertainment, as order. In every era there are systems of power that demand obedience, that demand compliance. They punish the marginalized, the inconvenient, the expendable. The spectacle of suffering might look different today. We no longer gather in amphitheaters to watch people die for sport. But how often do we watch violence play out in other ways? On screens, in news stories, or in social media feeds? How often do we consume the pain of others from the comfort of our homes, detached, disinterested, until the next viral moment shifts our focus? The mechanisms of cruelty may have changed their form, but they are still with us. The Colosseum was built for spectacle, but it was also built for control. It was built to reinforce the idea that certain people, certain bodies, were meant to be sacrificed for the entertainment of others. The arena's audience wasn't just watching, they were learning. They were being conditioned to accept the idea that some lives were less valuable, that suffering could be justified, and that entertainment could be derived from human pain. It's easy to say that we are beyond such things, that our civilization has progressed. But have we truly escaped the logic of the arena? Is there not still a hunger for spectacle? A willingness to turn a blind eye when people suffer for reasons we don't fully understand or care to confront? How many times have we seen injustice played out in the media, where the pain of the oppressed becomes just another story, another hashtag with a life cycle, until it fades into the background of our lives? Take a moment to think of the countless ways we witness suffering now. The wars we watch unfold on our screens, the exploitation of workers in sweatshops, the environmental devastation that doesn't make the front pages, the stadiums we fill with fans who cheer on the performers, the athletes, the warriors, while those who aren't performing become invisible, expendable. The same principles that allowed the arena to thrive, the objectification of suffering, the spectacle of death, the commodification of pain, are still woven into the fabric of society. They're just more subtle now, embedded in systems that ensure that those who are disposable remain so, and that those who are entertained remain distracted. And then, there are the other forms of spectacle, the ways in which we dehumanize, isolate, and label people to justify their treatment. We may not burn people alive in arenas anymore, but there are still systems in place that strip people of their dignity, their humanity, and reduce them to mere categories: criminals, refugees, workers, subordinates, categories that make it easier to ignore their suffering, or worse, to believe that they deserve it. The truth is that the arena never really disappeared. It shifted, it evolved, but the need for spectacle, for the consumption of suffering, for the production of order through violence, is still with us. It's just less visible. The crowds may have dispersed, but the systems of power continue to operate, the mechanisms of control continue to turn, and the suffering goes on. What's the solution? How do we escape the arena's logic, or at least recognize it when it reappears in different forms? It begins with awareness. It starts with telling these stories, with refusing to let the patterns of the past repeat unchecked. It starts with confronting the uncomfortable truths about power, suffering, and how we interact with both. The Colosseum, the amphitheaters, the spectacle of public execution, they're a warning, not just to those who lived in Rome, but to us here now. We must ask ourselves, how do we treat the most vulnerable? How do we allow suffering to unfold? And what role do we play in its continuation? It is easy to turn away, to say that the past is past, that the world has changed. But if we do not acknowledge the lessons of the arena, if we do not recognize how the mechanisms of control continue to function today, we are doomed to perpetuate the same cycles of cruelty, the same spectacles of suffering. Remember the blood minus soaked sand. Remember the crowds that cheered. And remember that the arena was not just a place of death, it was a place of education, a place of manipulation, a place where people learned that cruelty could be framed as entertainment. The question now is, how will we ensure that we do not become spectators in another arena, indifferent to the suffering of others, numb to the machinery of power at work behind the scenes? The story doesn't end. It continues, and we are the ones who write the next chapter. As the story of the arena fades into history, the lessons it offers remain crucial in our world today. The arena's logic of spectacle and control, of turning suffering into a form of entertainment for the powerful, didn't disappear. It simply evolved, adapting to new forms of power and control, often more subtle, but no less insidious. We no longer have public executions to entertain the masses. But in many ways, we still witness suffering as a form of spectacle. We see it in the entertainment industry, where trauma and hardship are often used as fuel for storytelling, or in the way we consume news about war, poverty, and injustice, often from a safe distance, desensitized by the sheer volume of it all. We still live in a world where certain people's suffering is viewed as less significant than others, where the marginalized, the oppressed, and the vulnerable are made into spectacle for the benefit of those in power. Whether it's through social media, media outlets, or the policies of governments, those who are deemed expendable are often reduced to mere statistics, their pain turned into headlines or viral videos. The story of rioters, i.e., of the countless lives lost in the arena, serves as a reminder of the dangers of forgetting the humanity of others. It warns us against the normalization of cruelty, the trivialization of suffering. It asks us to question how we interact with the pain of others, and whether we have become complicit in a system that continues to exploit and dehumanize. It's easy to look back at the Romans and condemn their cruelty, their obsession with spectacle, and their callous treatment of life. But the truth is, we are still part of a society that thrives on spectacle, that thrives on the consumption of pain. Whether it's the glorification of violence in media, the dehumanization of the poor, or the exploitation of labor, the essence of the arena lives on in the way we treat the marginalized. And so, the story must continue. We must ask ourselves hard questions. How do we react to the suffering of others? Are we spectators, passively watching the spectacle unfold, or are we participants, helping to perpetuate a system that thrives on inequality and cruelty? The answer lies in our actions, in the way we choose to engage with the world around us. We must recognize the legacy of the arena not as something ancient, but as something that is still alive today, waiting for us to either break the cycle or allow it to continue. The history of the Colosseum and the spectacles held within its walls is more than just a tale of ancient cruelty. It is a story of power, of control, of how societies can justify and normalize suffering. And it is a story that, in many ways, is still being written. The question now is, will we continue to be the audience, numb to the pain, or will we become the ones who demand an end to the cycle of cruelty? As we stand at the crossroads, it is clear that the power of the arena, the power to dehumanize, to turn pain into entertainment, will persist as long as we allow it. We must remember the lessons of history and choose not to be passive observers, but active participants in creating a world where compassion and empathy reign, where suffering is no longer reduced to spectacle. The story of the arena might be buried beneath the rubble of time, but its impact remains, echoing through the centuries. The question remains, how will we choose to write the next chapter?